been waiting for, please join me in welcoming Dr. Leslie Fenwick to the stage for our distinguished lecture.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Dean Mercer and the College of Education faculty for inviting me to deliver this year's Distinguished Researcher in Education lecture. I really consider it a privilege to join you today, and I want to pause again and recognize my friends, President and Mrs. Myers. Thank you for extending the invitation for me to be here. And for those of you who've not spoken to Mrs. Myers in any depth, you should, because she is a stellar educator. And has that career, as you probably know, in her past, and has a lot to offer in terms of your own understanding of contemporary issues and excellence in practice. You know that Pat and I are delighted to be here in the Little Apple, and we bring greetings and even a little gift, which I'll share later, from Howard University. And I have to ask my husband to stand and be recognized again as the President Emeritus of Howard University and the State University of New York at Albany. So you must stand. I'll take a moment of personal privilege here. I met one of the faculty earlier today who is an alum of Howard University in zoology, no less, with a minor in chemistry, and is on the faculty here. And I pinned her. I took the liberty of giving her a Howard University pin. I must share that this is not my first visit to Manhattan. I actually have President Myers some Kansas bona fides. My first and only visit until now to Manhattan was in 1963 when I was almost 2 years ago. Don't calculate the math and figure out my age, please. My dad, who's now a dentist, but then at the time was a science teacher in Washington, D.C. public schools, won a National Science Foundation teacher fellowship to study earth science right here at Kansas State University. And our family lived in graduate student housing, according to my parents, during a very, very, very hot summer for 6 to 8 weeks. So here I am 55 years later, and I'm very, very glad to return. And I mention this bit of family history, not just for the humor of it, but to underscore that Kansas State University has a long and distinguished history of being relevant. More than a century ago, the National Science Foundation identified a select cohort of institutions that would deliver teacher fellowship programs all across the country. And as you know from history, the Soviet Union had launched Sputnik a few years prior, and that spurred the US to regain prominence as a science and technology superpower. So political and academic leaders conspired and knew that in order for our nation to advance, public school teachers had to have cutting-edge knowledge and training to cultivate a new generation of students as future scientists and researchers. Kansas State University was one of those selected by the National Science Foundation, and it proved that KSU then, and KSU remains, a national resource, I believe, for moving our nation forward. So I'm pleased to be back, pleased to be joining you here. Well, today I come to you not so much as a former dean and not so much even as an education policy scholar, but as a former urban school teacher and administrator who has taught students from kindergarten through the doctoral levels. And these PK-12 school experiences inform my observations. I titled my remarks "Behind the Veil of School Reform," and I have just two streams of thought that I'd like to share with you. First is a stream of thought about the value of teacher diversity and what it means for our nation's schools. And the second is an examination of the economic forces that I believe are driving the proliferation of for-profit and other charter schools, privatization, and voucher proposals. I believe all of those are schemes that are deleterious to educational opportunity and restrict education equity and prevent the nation from really continuing down the path to have healthy public schools. I made sure, Dean, that my remarks are tethered to your school's noble mission, which says that the preparation programs here train students who are knowledgeable, who are ethical, who are caring decision makers who will inhabit a diverse and changing world. And so one of the reasons why I'm talking about these two topics is because I think they're relevant to your training programs and the information that you're receiving from your faculty. So more than 50 years ago, US President Lyndon Johnson signed into law, and all the education majors know this, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And he said that this landmark education legislation was intended to use public education as a lever to lift innocent children out of poverty. And here I quote Johnson, this is what he said: "We have the power to swing open a new door for the young people of America. For them and for this entire land of ours, it is the most important door that will ever open, the door to education." So I come to you to say, KSU educators, we have the power, and we must intend to use it. We have the power to eliminate education disparities and academic achievement in this new millennium. But before I begin the very formal part of my remarks, I am a former middle school teacher, so I have a pop quiz for you. I'd like to open with this pop quiz preface of sorts because I think it will challenge the assumptions that we come to our work about diversity, about inclusion, about urban schools with. I'm hoping that it challenges these things. And here I assert that we, the researchers, the scholars, the educators, the leaders, must interrupt an existing litany of pathology that dominates the research and social commentary about Black and poor communities. This litany of pathology doesn't paint an accurate picture of these communities of color. And I believe the consequence of repeated misinformation is threefold. One, misdirected policy, anemic practice interventions, and skewed funding streams. So when we don't challenge these unspoken assumptions, we then engage in an equation set that doesn't resolve the true issue or the core issues that we're seeking to resolve. So I want you to consider the answers to the following 4 questions and how these answers kind of frame your rethinking about contemporary urban school issues. Now, before I ask these questions, and they're about Black students, I could come up with a similar list of questions about Hispanic, Latinx students, Native American, first language, or indigenous students. So here are the 4 questions. You don't have to call out the answers. You cannot use any social media to find the answer to this. Okay. So my first question, again, remember my idea is to challenge some of your assumptions that guide our work and our investigation into urban schools. First, are there more Black men in prison or in college? More Black men in prison than college. And I hear you can call out some little answers if you want to, and I think I heard prison. And we often hear prison. In fact, a few years ago, and I won't name this famous person from corporate America who delivered remarks at Howard University, she said prison. But the answer is, in fact, there are 1.4 million, I'm looking at the president of our Call Me Mr. program, 1.4 million Black men in college and about 800,000 Black men in prison. Too many Black men in prison, but there are more Black men in college than in prison. But how many times have we heard, even in scholarly communities and academic settings, the reverse? But the truth of the matter is, and these are not Fenwick created statistics, there are more Black men in college than in prison. Okay? We as educators, scholars, members of the academic community, we must know this. Not only are those statistics true, they're empowering to a new generation of men who are thinking about college. They need to know they're not in the minority. There are more Black men in college than in prison. I guarantee, I say this when I'm in DC, if you go out on Georgia Avenue and you tell somebody that, they're gonna say, no, you're wrong. And you tell them, yes, I'm right. Look at Tolson 2017 as your reference and quote a dean. Sometimes you can quote a dean, okay? Sometimes you can quote a dean. The second question, and again, I want you to think about maybe how that fact reframes your understanding about some of the issues in urban education. What percentage of African American parents report setting aside, many of you are pre-service teachers, So what percentage of African American parents report setting aside a special time and place for their child to complete homework and have an adult in the household check it? So what percentage of African American parents report setting aside a time and then having an adult check that homework? The answer is 94% of I heard you, oh my God. 94% of African American parents report engaging in this school affirming behavior. This is the highest percentage for any subgroup of parents responding to the Parent and Family Involvement in Education survey conducted not by Fenwick, but by the National Center for Education Statistics, which is a center of the U.S. Department of Education. The last two questions. What percentage of Black and white parents report attending PTA meetings and parent-teacher conferences? So for those of you who are pre-service teachers, I want you to think about what you've learned about parental involvement. That last question speaks to parental involvement. This question speaks to parental involvement. The percentage of Black and white parents who report attending PTA meetings and report attending parent-teacher conferences. Again, according to the National Center for Education Statistics, 90% of white parents and 87% of Black parents report attending PTA meetings. 78% of white parents and 77% of Black parents report attending parent-teacher conferences. Now, you can say these statistics may or may not prevail in the school where you're doing your student teaching or currently serving, but at least these are the national statistics that the U.S. Department of Education is reporting to us. And I think it shifts and reframes some of our assumptions about parental involvement in education. And then this is my last question. Which demographic subgroup of 12th graders is least likely to use alcohol, tobacco, or illicit drugs? According to the National Institute for Drug Abuse, African American high school seniors consistently, so this is over 30 years of research, consistently have been found to have lower usage rates of alcohol, tobacco, and illicit drugs when compared to their white 12th grade peers. And this finding is also true among African American youth in the lower grades, from third grade through middle school, and African American college students attending historically Black colleges and universities. And I see some of you who are in psychology, you know some of these statistics. Well, I didn't give you these 4 questions and this recitation to be like Jeopardy. Alex, I'll take African Americans for 600. That's not my intention here. But what I am trying to relay to you is that we need to go about more of our work in practice and policy and research from a strengths or asset-based approach. And I'm also urging us, whether we're educators or psychologists, counselors, pre-service principals or superintendents or just community leaders, to peel back these layers of erroneous and negative statistics that we hear each and every day about Black boys and girls and Black men and women and Black families and Black communities and other communities of color. And I really challenge you as scholars to go out and collect similar questions and answers to kind of rattle our assumptions about what we think about each other. And these erroneous notions continue to get repeated, and they create divisiveness, and they create misunderstandings between groups of people. And so I challenge you to seek more affirming data. The last thing I'll say about this little pop quiz and preface is this: the common practice, you will experience this. For those of you who are pre-service educators and you go off to national conferences, many scholarly presentations begin with a litany of negative statistics about Blacks. And I think that when that happens, it reinforces 3 erroneous notions. These negative statistics become synonymous with negative human qualities, which are then attributed to the true nature of Black people. That's first. Second, this persistence of negative statistics about Black communities, kind of the subtext of that is we're a community beyond intervention, and that's not true. And then thirdly, rarely does such study result in effective solutions. Rather, the result of misinformation, constant misinformation, is a misdirection of funding and failed policy and program interventions. To find effective solutions, and for those of us who are teachers and counselors and principals and superintendents, and aspire to those roles, to find effective solutions to the issues that legitimately beset American society, I think that we have to embrace W.E.B. Du Bois's admonition. In his examination, almost 100 years ago, of the Philadelphia slums, this is what he said, and I think it's still applicable. So I'm not saying barter away what we know isn't working to tell some rose-colored picture. I'm saying let's make sure the data that we're sharing is accurate. And this is what Du Bois says: a slum is not a simple fact. It's a symptom. And that to know the removable causes of the Negro slums of Philadelphia requires a study that takes one far beyond the slum districts. So he's telling researchers way back in the 1900s, if you want to study poverty, if you want to study Black people in poverty, the study of the slum where they happen to reside, if you really want to study the core cause for that community, it's going to take you well beyond that community to look at the political and the economic and the social structure that created that slum. And I think Du Bois's charge is still relevant to us. So this leads me to some conversation about the value of teacher diversity, and I know you're training here around diversity and inclusion issues, and I applaud the curriculum that exists and what the faculty are doing to advance these notions, because you, pre-service teachers and principals and superintendents and counselors and psychologists, you are going to inherit a more diverse world than ever before. And in fact, you know, demographers told us, I was just saying this to a group of faculty earlier, demographers initially told us that by 2075, the US would become, for the first time in its history, a majority minority country. I hate that phrase, but I'm using it for simplicity's sake. And what they essentially were telling us is in 2075, the US population of citizens would be majority people of color for the first time in the history of our nation. They moved that to 2055. And now they're saying 2044. And I believe it's 2024. I look at the census data almost every week, several times a week. My brother Jason calls me Rain Man when it comes to census data. You remember that movie a long time ago where he was kind of an idiot savant, but he was focused on certain things. So my point in raising that is you are likely, you pre-service teachers, pre-service principals, pre-service superintendents, policymakers, psychologists and counselors are encountering a new world that we, adults, have not experienced. Okay? You're going to be leading in the most diverse and inclusive society, I believe, in the world. Okay? So this issue around teacher diversity and student diversity are well matched and relevant to the future that you're going to be leading us through. Well, there's a quote, "You are my other me. If I do harm to you, I do harm to me." This is how school teacher Curtis Acosta is shown opening his class in the independent Lens film, Precious Knowledge. If you haven't seen it, you'll want to watch it. It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful, and it's not long. The film chronicles how in 1997, community activism led the Tucson City Council to set up a study committee to examine ways to boost Latinx students' academic achievement and reduce the dropout rate of Latinx students in Tucson, Arizona. And based on the study's findings, the school board unanimously voted to create what was then called the Hispanic Studies Department. By 2002, the Hispanic Studies Department, which was in Tucson School District, was renamed Mexican American Raza Studies, and the district instituted departments of African American Studies, Pan-Asian Studies, and Native American Studies. So the district made this huge push to have fields of study that were attractive to all students. The departments offered ethnic study courses that were open to all students and were based on deep cultural knowledge and the use of Spanish and other languages to relay cultural concepts. And the experiment by Tucson public schools worked. Graduation rates for Latinx students, which had hovered around 54%, skyrocketed to 93%. And yet, in 2011, the state superintendent of public education, I took his name out of my speech. I had it in there before. My husband said, don't do that, Leslie. So I took his name out of my speech. Called on Tucson Unified School District to abolish the program. In disbanding the program, this official called it un-American and divisive. And a rally of parents and students and teachers protested the program's closing publicly. And at this protest, the state superintendent said, I think the chanting behind us illustrates the rudeness of what they teach their kids. Okay, that was divisive. The program was effective. Well, I mention this because Tucson and more than 40 years of research prove that all children achieve when they have culturally competent teachers. Let's be clear. And this is a hard truth. One of your previous distinguished lecturers talked about hard truths. So I think this is a hard truth. So let's be clear. White children's school achievement is purposely tied to their having white models of intellectual authority in their classrooms and schools, and images of white cultural superiority predominate in all of our curricular materials. We're doing a better job, but we're not quite there yet. So look at the textbooks across subject areas. You're pre-service teachers. I was a pre-service teacher in Virginia. When I looked at the textbooks, I think our textbooks now are more diverse, but we're not quite there yet. And look at the reading lists that K-12 students are exposed to on a daily basis. So white students have these three things supporting their academic achievement: models of intellectual authority, teachers and principals. Do you know that nearly 40% of the nation's 14,000 school districts, so out of the 14,000 school districts, nearly 40% of them have no teacher of color? We're doing a better job. We still have a ways to go. All textbook and supplementary reading materials are nearly exclusively white in authorship and content and storyline. And those who construe standardized tests, they're psychometricians. Some of you are training to be statisticians, psychometricians, who come up with item differentiation equations. Now I'm speaking to the psych faculty. Drop test items that, for instance, Black students score well on when those same test items are not scored well on by white high-scoring test takers. I hope that made some sense. But there's a convergence of modeling and materials that impact the academic achievement of white students. Now, I say in response to that, we have a wonderful resource in our country. The Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture is available to all teachers all across this country, and many of their resources have been digitized, to use to educate yourself about the history, the full history of America that includes African American achievement. Many of those resources have been digitized and are available to you online. Well, from more than a quarter century of research, we know that who stands in front of the classroom and what knowledge children are taught makes a difference in their school persistence and academic achievement. A recently released study, it's in this week's Education Week, so if you Google Education Week, you can read the study, says that 60% of variance in students' academic achievement is tied to the quality of the teacher who's standing in front of the classroom. That means 40% is tied to the home, tied to the child, him or herself. But 60%, the largest variance, and that's a variance that we can control. You already know that there's a tremendous demographic mismatch between the nation's public school students and the school personnel who serve them. Let's go inside Central City schools. Okay. 71% of teachers in Central City schools are white. Come out of Central City schools. 91% of teachers in urban schools outside of Central City rings are white. 68% of inner city school principals are white. Now, why do I mention this statistic? It speaks to the importance, I think, of the Call Me Mr. program and diversifying our teaching force. All children benefit when we have diverse models of intellectual authority in front of the classroom. Well, the question then becomes, is there anything that we can do about this mismatch, or is there anything that should be done? And I ask you this question, which the Carnegie Forum on Education and the Economy raised in 1986. This was the Carnegie Forum's question to the nation. Can the nation tolerate a future in which white and minority children are confronted with almost exclusively white authority figures in their schools? And they asked the question because embedded in the question is the answer, no, that we need to do a better job of diversifying our teacher force and our school leadership force. Today's public school student, and many of you know this already, is more likely to be African American, Hispanic, Latinx, or Asian than white, and less likely to speak English as a first language. Most English language learners, most ELL students, those who speak a first language other than English, are not immigrants, and they are US born. In fact, nearly 60% of ELL adolescents are American citizens. And Spanish isn't the only language ELL students are speaking. Chinese, Arabic, Haitian Creole, Hmong, Vietnamese, and Somali are in the top 10 languages spoken in American schools by our students. How this new American public school majority performs academically is critically important to the nation's productive future. And you stand at the gateway. Remember Johnson's charge that still speaks to us. We can fling open the doors of education to these new students, to this group of students, or not. And he encourages us 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago, to fling open the doors of education, the most important door there is. And there's a clear relationship. In case we aren't convinced of diversity inclusion because of the moral commitment or the ethical commitment, we have at least 30 years of research that shows a clear relationship between teacher quality, diversity, and student success. Black and poor students are 70% more likely than their white and affluent peers to have a teacher who's not certified, not in one subject, not in two, not in three, but in 4 subjects. So if we are a school, let's pretend like we're a school for a minute, and half of us are on free or reduced lunch, which is how we measure poverty status. So 50% of us are on free or reduced lunch, and we're a school that's majority Black and brown. You as the students, before I know anything about your family, you are 70% more likely to have a teacher who's not certified in math, not certified in science, not certified in English, not certified in social studies, teaching you. So let's say this is a math class. You come in here, we're a poor minority school. The teacher who's standing in front of you to teach math may be certified in phys ed, but not math. What do you think that's going to do to your math scores? You're right, okay? So in addition to that, they're more likely to not have a college major or minor in that field. So this, I think, is coupled with the fact that 82% of Black students go to schools in states where there are high stakes tests, standardized tests required. You're required to pass those tests in order to progress to the next grade or graduate, compared to 66% of white students. I'm mentioning these data not to demonize white and make Black an angel condition. I'm saying there are these discrepancies that exist, these structural discrepancies that exist that impede students' access to an equal education or an adequate education. So how can we, I ask you this question, how can we continue to raise the bar on what we require students to know, but lower the bar on the credentialing of those who stand before our students and children as their teachers? Clearly, the nation deserves and needs dedicated teachers of every hue and every creed. I think we need teachers who are Black, who are white, who are Hispanic, Latinx, who are Asian, who are gay, who are straight, who are members of the LGBTQAI community, who wear hijabs, who speak Spanish. The larger our army of teachers are, the more American students we will reach. But we've learned from educational research that there are benefits to teacher diversity that can advance the nation's aspiration to close academic achievement and attainment gaps. The majority of Americans, year after year, in national polls by Gallup, say they support integration in the nation's public schools. Over 90% of Americans, including this year's poll, say they support integration and that the place that should happen is American public schools. But what do we know from research studies when African American and Hispanic Latinx students, when they attend schools with high concentrations of African American or Hispanic Latinx teachers, what happens? African American, Hispanic, Latinx students are less likely to be expelled or suspended. They're more likely to be tested for gifted education. They're less likely to be placed in special education, and they're more likely to graduate high school in 4 years. So we already know from the data that we've gathered about the impact of African American and Hispanic Latinx teachers and African American and Hispanic Latinx students that there are some positive academic and social outcomes. And so I believe the more we diversify our teaching force, the more positive benefits will accrue socially and academically to our students. Additionally, in studies about teacher perception of African American male students, some researchers have found that African American teachers are more likely than others to describe African American male students as intellectually gifted, and to report that these students engaged in positive behaviors such as homework completion, attending school regularly, and assuming leadership roles in the classroom. More recent longitudinal studies show that African American and Hispanic Latinx teachers spur the math achievement of African American and Hispanic Latinx students. Klopfenstein has a very interesting report, that reported that the enrollment of African American students in Algebra 2 increased significantly as a percentage of mathematics teachers in the school rose who were African American. And Ehrenberg and Brewer they are economists, and they used an econometric model, and they found an increase in the percentage of African American teachers resulted in score gains on standardized tests for African American high school students. And the final piece of research that I'll provide to you, pre-service teachers and principals and superintendents, is that there are other findings by Farkas, Grobe, Sheehan, and Schuon that African American teachers influenced positively African American student school attendance, and that these teachers had higher expectations for their African American students than other teacher counterparts. And Hess and Leal found a correlation between the number of teachers of color in a district and college matriculation rates for students of color. Now, having said all this literature that supports, with an empirical base, the moral argument for more teacher diversity, I want to make it clear that I am not supporting or suggesting same race and ethnic pairing of teachers and students. What I'm really trying to show you is that there is an empirical database to support that teacher diversity impacts students' social, academic, and social outcomes, and that they benefit from schools and communities and children benefit from teacher diversity. So how can we ensure that all the nation's school children have diverse and qualified teachers? I believe that one thing we must do is invest in historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, and Hispanic serving institutions. And we at Howard, a number of HBCUs have partnerships with institutions just like K-State. But I wanted you to know a fact about HBCUs and HSIs, Hispanic serving institutions, that you may not know. HBCUs are only 3% of the nation's 4,000 or so colleges and universities, so they're a tiny portion. And yet they prepare 50% of the nation's school teachers who are Black. So if we lost HBCUs, we'd lose 50% of the nation's Black teachers. And HSIs, Hispanic serving institutions, there are two in particular, two HSIs, prepare 90% of the nation's Hispanic Latinx teachers. So without HBCUs and HSIs preparing teachers of color, the nation wouldn't meet its aspiration to have a diverse teaching force. The second reason I share this perspective with you is to advance the idea, the notion of opportunity to learn, OTL. For some of you in education leadership, you've read some of these OTL studies, and I'm urging you to think about teacher diversity along with opportunity to learn in a new kind of education equity formula. And this is what that new education equity formula would say. That equity exists in a school, and I want you to test this notion for those of you who are teacher ed students. When you go back to your school, I want you to test this notion. The OTL, Opportunity to Learn scholars, say that equity exists in a school when these three conditions are met. Students are experiencing equal access to all the school's available benefits and services. One way you can check that is when you look in gifted education classes, are those classrooms diverse? This first condition, students are experiencing equal access to all the school's available benefits and service. Second, equal treatment within schools in terms of the quality of social interaction. So all students are treated equitably and equal relative to disciplinary policies, interpersonal relationships, opportunity to lead, plays, and student government. So students are experiencing equal access and students are experiencing equal treatment. And the third, equal educational outcomes for both genders and all racial, ethnic, linguistic subgroups identified within the school population. So do you notice balances or imbalances? And how do you as a teacher, and teachers are activists, right? So how do you as a teacher help to balance those things that are out of balance? Not just critique and throw darts at, but work gently to balance those things that may not be in balance. I believe that we must not just advocate an equal opportunity to learn as a criterion for judging schools, but rather an equalizing opportunity to learn. All students must have the opportunity to engage in the kinds of curricula and instruction that prepares them to achieve expected standards. Do all students have an equitable opportunity to learn? What kinds of standards and measures should be used to determine a school's effectiveness as an equitable learning institution? Well, we know the factors. 30 years of effective schools research remain relevant and support the primacy of teacher quality. Having a teacher who's qualified, certified, and trained in the subject area that he or she is teaching. That's one measure that equitable education is occurring, if that's occurring in each classroom. The other is principal stability, tenure stability, and years of experience as a teacher. Students' access. Number 3, upper level mathematics courses, advanced placement, and gifted education courses. Do we see an equitable distribution of male and female students, students of color in these classes? And then finally, access to science labs and high quality instructional technology. We've had, in the last 20 years, more of an emphasis on accountability as the way that we judge our schools, and the accountability movement has spurred a lot of activity and conversation about urban school reform. And so I want to talk to you about my perspective about urban school reform and what I see as someone who's been in education since 1983, either as a teacher, an assistant principal, or a principal, or a higher education faculty in education, or an administrator. And the question I'm asking you here are what forces and who are really controlling the education and socialization of Black, brown, and poor urban school children? And how are we called on, all of us, as educators and scholars, to correct these misguided forces? And I think they are misguided. That's my bias here. So let's look behind the veil of urban school reform. I believe that urban school reform is not about schools or kids. I believe it's about land development, specifically using schools to recalculate urban land value and make gentrifying urban communities more palatable to more affluent residents. There's a book that I hope that you read, and it's called The Color of School Reform. And the author, the first author is Henig, H-E-N-I-G, Henig, The Color of School Reform. And the scholars in this book affirm in their study of 3 cities, Baltimore, Detroit, and Atlanta, the following: that many key figures who are promoting these broad kind of efficiency-oriented reform initiatives for urban schools either lived in suburbs or sent their children to private schools. And they raise this as the opening statement in their book to say, well, these folk aren't devoted to public schools and don't know the urban context, and yet they are dictating much of what we see in urban school reform. Local control, that is elected school boards, is supposed to empower communities and parents, residents, but this rarely happens in school districts that experience urban school reform. I believe that too often predators eager to exploit schools for their own benefit short-circuit the work of deep and lasting school and community uplift. And I will tell you, because I know you're reading about this in newspapers and in your own scholarship, I don't believe that mayoral control of schools, I don't believe that Teach for America, I don't believe that education management organization and venture capital funded charter schools are the answer. And they've not garnered a lot of support or grassroots enthusiasm from parents who are in urban districts and send their children to urban schools. Many of those parents view these schemes as uninformed by their community and disconnected from the best interest of their children. So I want you to think about mayoral control for a minute. You either have read a lot about that or will read a lot about it. You may experience this as a teacher if you decide to teach in an urban setting. Mayoral control proposes to expand educational opportunities for Black and poor students, but more often than not, new schools are placed in upper income gentrifying areas of town, while the schools that are in sections of town that serve Black and poor children are closed. So what happens here is there's an increase in the level of education inequity. Inner city residents are suspicious of school reform, particularly when it's attached to neighborhood revitalization, which they view as an imposition from the external moneyed elites who are exclusively committed to using schools to recalculate urban land value at the expense of inner city children, parents, and communities. Well, I believe that in order for us to recapture the education and socialization of urban students of color, that we must commit to a new understanding. The moral imperative to support deep and lasting change in urban communities and reclaim public education cannot be driven by mayoral control. I don't think that it can be driven by teacher displacing anti-union Teach for America. I think that we have to pay attention to what the NAACP and MALDAF, the Mexican American Legal and Education Defense Fund, say about the Teach for America model. They say that the missionary model has not been a friend to Black and brown people, and that putting unprepared teachers in schools that serve exclusively Black, brown, and poor children is discriminatory and harmful. That's exactly the language that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal used when it was talking about the Teach for America model. And I don't think that urban school reform can be driven by deep-pocketed venture capital-backed philanthropists who think they know what's best for urban schools and rarely interact with teachers who have worked in those schools. You as teachers, many of you will go into urban settings, some of you will go into suburban settings, some of you will go into rural settings, but this is what I want you to remember from my remarks. When we hear about these schemes moving into urban districts, mayoral control, for-profit charter schools, I want you to realize that these schemes only predominate in poor districts. If they were excellent models, why wouldn't we see them? And I see some of your faculty and some of you as students shaking your head. Why wouldn't we see them in high-performing districts? I think that we as educators and researchers and practitioners have to call out these schemes and propose solutions that don't exploit the nation's neediest children and barter away the ideal of public education. Vouchers and the other billionaire-backed schemes are being done unto, not for, communities of color. And they're not in the community's best interest and do not build school or community capacity. In fact, these schemes, vouchers, privatization, for-profit charter schools, result in two negative outcomes in my experience and opinion. First, the elimination of elected school boards, which obliterates citizens' democratic right to have a say in their public schools. Second, it pilfers away taxpayers' money that support public schools, and there's no accountability system to kind of manage how that money is being spent. I think that we have to loudly interrogate the hand of modern philanthropists in public education. I think this is difficult to do because it's, let's be honest, it's hard to interrogate the hand if you take money from it. I want you to think about this. The most prominent billionaires, and you can name them, who are underwriting the urban school reform scheme, specifically for-profit charter schools and infusing Teach for America into urban schools, they fund these quick draw school startups which simultaneously create public relation campaigns using the faces of Black, brown, and poor children and tear-jerking mission statements about their uplift. And yet these same billionaires fund English-only, anti-worker rights campaign, spew anti-immigration hate legislation, can't diversify their own company's leadership, and don't create jobs that benefit communities captured in cycles of poverty and neglect. So I would like to say to the billionaires, why is this so? And why can't you use your money and your innovation to create more jobs? We know that there's 50 years of research that say that if you pull a female-headed household out of poverty, it benefits children for generations. But once a family is caught in intractable poverty, their children are dramatically worse off in terms of quality school options and the likelihood of high school graduation and high academic achievement. It is true that public schools have been and are underserving children of color and those who live in poverty. But it's a lie that for-profit charter schools, vouchers, privatization, and Teach for America and venture-backed charter schools are the answer. There are some questions that we must ask. Why are billionaires tinkering with school management typologies and dictating curriculum scripts and scraping together instructional protocols? Why has Teach for America gone international to Africa and South America? Why do we believe that vouchers will lift children out of poverty? U.S. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos has hailed Indiana's voucher program as a model for other states. But here are some troubling facts about that. Almost half, 44%, of the Indiana students receiving vouchers are from families whose annual income tops $55,000 a year. In fact, in 2016, about 20% of Indiana school kids who received vouchers were from families earning less than $25,000. And 60% of Indiana voucher kids are white. So much for the voucher program liberating poor Black and brown kids from underperforming government schools. The last analogy and a few recommendations I'd like to leave you with relate to the caliber or the kind of education that I feel that too many poor children are receiving in this country. So I want you to imagine shopping at a grocery chain. We've all had this experience. If you go to the store in an affluent community, and if you eat meat and you go back to the meat counter, you're likely to find the meat marked fresh ground daily, okay? Now go to that same chain in a very poor neighborhood, and I did this little exercise some years ago, and you're more likely to find at the meat counter gray meat wrapped in pink paper under an orange light, for sale. And I say that in a similar vein, too many of the nation's poor children are getting a gray meat wrapped in pink paper under an orange light type of education. And we have to know this because there's such an emphasis on testing. You're the generation of teachers and counselors and principals and superintendents who know this. But if we continue to educationally malnourish children on this gray meat wrapped in pink paper under an orange light, and then test them, that's not going to yield much progress. What will yield progress is changing the inputs, changing the nourishment that the children get. That's called equity, providing children with what they need so that they can achieve. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see poor children trapped in underperforming schools. So what's the final thing, final set of recommendations that I can offer? What can we do as researchers, as people interested in policy, as teachers and counselors and principals and superintendent aspirants? What can we do? I have 5 recommendations before I'll conclude, just some brief statements. First, I think we can all, whether we're a citizen or an education professional, affirm that teacher quality is one of the most important factors that we can control influencing student achievement. And new research tells us, as I mentioned before, that teacher quality affects 60% of the variance in students' academic achievement. Number 2, we can support the research findings indicating that teacher preparation, certification, and tenure each dramatically and positively impact student achievement. So we want our teachers to be high quality, we want them to be certified. Number 3, we can confront, when we see this, the injustice of having untrained teachers in schools serving clusters of poor students and higher percentage of students of color. So we can confront the injustice of having poor students in this country be 70% more likely to encounter a teacher who's not certified in 4 subject areas. We can call that out. And then finally, we can assert what the NAACP and MALDAF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, say, that no, Teach for America. You can't microwave a teacher in 5 or 8 weeks and plop them into a classroom serving the nation's neediest students. Well, I want to come back as I close out to President Johnson. The reason I love President Johnson is he was a teacher, and he was the only president, US president, who was a teacher. And so I think he had a certain compassion, and you know that his administration created ESEA, the Elementary, Secondary, and Education Act, and HEA, the Higher Education Act. He did many expansive programs to pull more Americans into the experience of high quality education. Well, he had a speech on March 15th, 1965, and I believe his speech is still relevant to our contemporary work to improve public education and create a nation of diverse and capable citizens. And this is what Johnson said in that speech. He said, of course, people cannot contribute to the nation if they are never taught to read or write, if their bodies are stunted from hunger, if their sickness goes untended, if their life is spent in hopeless poverty just drawing a welfare check. So what do we want to do, America? We want to open the gates to opportunity, but we're also going to give all of our people the help that they need to walk through that gate. My first job, this is Johnson talking, my first job after college was as a teacher in Cotulla, Texas, in a small Mexican-American school. Few of them could speak English, and I couldn't speak much Spanish. My students were poor. They often came to class without breakfast. They were often hungry. And they knew, even in their youth, the pain of prejudice. They never seemed to know why people disliked them, but they knew it was so because I saw it in their eyes. And when I walked home late in the afternoon after classes were finished, wishing there was more that I could do, but all I knew was to teach them the little that I knew, hoping that I might help them against the hardships that lay ahead. And somehow you never forget what poverty and hatred can do when you see its scars on the hopeful face of a young child. I never thought then in 1928 that I would be standing here in 1965. It never even occurred to me in my fondest dreams that I might have the chance to help the sons and the daughters of my students, those Spanish-speaking students, and to help people like them all over this country. But now I have the chance, America, and I'll let you in on a secret. I mean to use it. President Johnson was correct. We have the power. KSU educators, we must intend to use it. Thank you for letting me join you here this afternoon. I'd like to close, and I'm going to ask my husband, because he was the president of Howard, to come forward to do this. We have a small but meaningful token to give to our KSU hosts. I've been delighted to be here and to meet the KSU community and feel welcomed like family. So I'm going to hand you the pin, President Emeritus Swigert. Will you pin our president with a Howard pin? Is he allowed to wear a Howard pin?
For one day.
For one day?
I better get dressed for this ceremony.
And I'm then going to call forward our First Lady, a distinguished educator herself. Pat wants to pin you as well.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Fenwick. What a